So this is a video going over my thoughts on the Best Picture nominees for the 2023 Oscars. Before I begin, I just want to say that I haven't actually seen Triangle of Sadness or Women Talking, so I won't be talking about those here, but I wanted to discuss the nominees anyway. Other than that, you don't have to worry about spoilers, this is a spoiler-free zone. All Quiet on the Western Front is a German film that was adapted from a novel of the same name. This novel has actually been adapted before in the 1930s, but I had never seen that going into this film. It is a pretty simple war movie that lacks a traditionally developed central character. It is very much following the trends of Dunkirk in 1917, with the exception that those films are more focused on making you feel tension, whereas All Quiet on the Western Front is more focused on making you feel horrified. It's kind of like if the modern style of Dunkirk in 1917 met a heavily toned down and less satisfying Come and See. The cinematography is pretty great and there are some cool musical cues. There are some particular moments that stick with you and are genuinely some of the better scenes I've ever seen in war movies as of late. There's one particular scene that I don't want to spoil, but it genuinely sent a shiver down my spine, and its honest portrayal of just how brutal and horrific war can be. I guess my main issue with the movie is that I wish it would have gone even further. There are many scenes in this film where I felt like it was holding itself back in some way or was purposely trying to give the audience levity. It spends a decent amount of time trying to develop a group of characters, but I can't help but feel like the movie falls completely flat in those moments. It would have worked better if the film moved from one horror to another without letting the audience get a rest. The scenes in this movie that worked for me were amazing, but there was just too much downtime in a film where I would have liked it to hold its audience's feet to the fire a bit more. Overall, it's still a pretty good war movie with some great moments, and I highly recommend checking it out if it seems like something you'd be into. I'm giving this one a 3.5 out of 5. Avatar: The Way of Water is the new big blockbuster directed by James Cameron, and it was kind of disappointing in my opinion. This is a 3-hour and 12-minute long film that just feels so incredibly formulaic and cliche. And while the first film was formulaic as well, I felt that it served as a good basis for an experimental film that used visuals to enhance the tone and emotion of what was happening. The original Avatar has a much more fleshed out and engaging angle of the Na'vi and their relationship with nature, and the CGI helps to sell this. Pandora is this beautiful and vibrant place where the environment is reacting to the characters being there. While Avatar: The Way of Water may have better CGI, the original is the more beautiful movie in my opinion. Even if we take the stories in isolation, the original was a way more focused and singular story, whereas the sequel feels like it meanders around so many different characters and events that it never truly commits to developing them in a way that gets me emotionally invested. It kind of feels like the movie falls into a bunch of subplots that are often incredibly tropey and boring. I also don't think it's really much of a spoiler at this point to say that the main villain of this movie is basically the same one as the original movie, which just feels like a slap to the face in my opinion. Not only was the villain of the first Avatar one of the weakest aspects of that film, but it also just feels incredibly contrived and lazy. The CGI is incredible in this movie, and without a doubt it is the best I've ever seen, but that alone does not make a movie. Those aspects have to be in service of something and serve to complement the story, but it just doesn't really feel like that's what I got with this film. Nature plays a huge role in this universe, and the original Avatar uses its CGI to sell this fact to the audience by making you feel alive. I just didn't really get that out of The Way of Water. So yeah, if you're super excited to see the new Avatar, definitely don't let me stop you, but I'm giving this a 2 out of 5. It was really boring. Okay, next up is The Banshees of Inisherin, directed by Martin McDonagh, which is my third favorite nominee on this list. We watch the film from his perspective as he attempts to understand why his friend would no longer want to talk to him. What makes this movie super interesting in my opinion is just the dynamic and differing worldviews of these two characters. The main character, played by Colin Farrell, is a pretty simple-minded individual who takes pleasure in these simple things in life, whereas his friend, played by Brendan Gleeson, feels like he needs to make an impact on the world before he goes. These two characters fundamentally don't really understand one another, and Brendan Gleeson's character is willing to take things to pretty drastic lengths to make sure Colin Farrell's character doesn't talk to him. The way that the movie builds curiosity in the audience but also gradually builds tension between these two characters is really investing. Both of them have their own justifications for acting the way they act, which are completely believable. It's also worth mentioning that this movie is surprisingly funny and has a sense of humor. The humorous elements slowly fade away as the plot progresses, but they're there for a large portion of the movie and they give a lot of levity to the experience. The acting in this movie is pretty amazing all around, and it also has a really nice quiet score that accompanies the film well. So yeah, I kind of love this movie and think everybody should check it out. It's surprisingly accessible and it is a film that probably anyone could find some enjoyment in. I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. Elvis is probably the worst movie on the list of nominees. Like I said, I haven't seen Triangle of Sadness or Women Talking, but I don't expect those to be nearly as bad as this movie. Don't get me wrong, there are aspects to this movie that I enjoy. In particular, I really enjoyed Austin Butler's performance as Elvis. There are definitely times where it feels like he is overacting or exaggerating Elvis's persona, but in general, I found him to be the most consistently engaging aspect of the film. There are several issues I have with this film, but the biggest ones are its length and its editing. This movie is 3 hours long, but at no point did I ever feel like it earned its length. In particular, there are several extremely long and arduous sequences where Elvis is singing. I understand that this is a movie about Elvis, but I really don't feel like his songs should be taking up such a large portion of the film. If I want to listen to Elvis, I can go on Spotify or Apple Music and listen to his songs. What I really desire out of a biopic like this is a deep dive into the background of the person the film is about. There are definitely parts where I got that, but it didn't feel very unique or interesting. A lot of actors and artists have been exploited and gamed by the system, but I feel like these biopic movies never come up with a unique or interesting way to dive into those aspects. They are all incredibly generic and feel the exact same to one another. This film also portrays Elvis as kind of like a naive idiot, which makes it a lot more difficult to sympathize with him when he gets screwed over by contracts he didn't even bother to read. The editing in this film is also utterly atrocious. It is a nauseating roller coaster ride that is so unfitting for the type of movie this is. It's a biopic that's cut together as if it's an action movie or a trailer.
There's been a lot of talk about the new Elvis. And of course, that other guy. You ain't nothing but a hound dog.
It seems like they were trying to be super artful with the editing, but honestly it just comes across as unnecessary and pretentious. It feels as though no thought was given to cutting together the movie in a way that would be complementary to what is happening in the story. It is a 3-hour-long movie that feels incredibly slow and nauseatingly fast at the same time. Tom Hanks' performance in the movie was also super weird. I guess he was trying something different, but it just comes across as goofy and overly animated.
Am I the only one who ever thinks about Elvis's security? Hospital!
There are also some really odd and overly modern musical choices in this movie that are super distracting. It's trying to be a period piece, but at the same time is happy to throw in a random Doja Cat song with no regard to what is consistent or complementary to the tone. So yeah, I kind of thought this movie was awful. I actually had it as a 2 out of 5 on my Letterboxd account, but as I am writing this, I think I'll lower it to a 1.5 out of 5. It's just so messy and inconsistent that not even a great central performance can keep this thing together. Everything Everywhere All at Once was directed by the Daniels and is honestly one of the most ambitious film projects I've ever seen. This is a movie where there is so much going on and is completely chaotic, but it's somehow able to ground the viewer with a consistent through line and not feel messy at all. This is a movie that manages to balance a lot of different tones and genres, and it does it to a masterful level. This movie is simultaneously hilarious and profound. It's an action movie, but it's also an existential soap opera. This movie gets down to some pretty ambitious themes about the meaning and purpose of existence that will definitely resonate with younger people like me. It speaks to the overwhelming and daunting nihilism that a lot of people my age experience, and instead of trying to convince the audience of some entirely different worldview and shove a different perspective down our throats, it instead reframes the idea of nihilism into something that is not so scary or bad. It is ridiculously ambitious, and it somehow manages to pull all this off. It is a 2-hour, 20-minute long movie that never drags or feels boring. The action choreography and camera work is super energetic and fun. There are some really cool editing choices, and the editing in general does a good job of keeping the story digestible at all times. It's a movie that tackles some big ideas and themes, but it is so fun and digestible that I would have no problem recommending this to pretty much anyone. Personally, seeing as this is a movie that has had a big impact on our culture and just how well made it is, this is my personal pick for what I think should win Best Picture. Out of all the nominees, it's surely the one that will be remembered for the longest and for good reason. I initially had this movie rated as a 5 out of 5 on my Letterboxd, but changed it to a 4.5 out of 5 on my 5th rewatch because I felt the first half was a little exposition heavy. But as I'm talking about it now, I think I want to change my rating back to a 5 out of 5. Ultimately, my rating is a reflection of how a movie impacted me. I don't consider the Lord of the Rings trilogy to be technically perfect in execution, but they are excellently made films that give me a 10 out of 10 experience, and I sort of feel the same way about this. There are some minor things I could point out that could be better, but ultimately it's a matter of how much I want to let those things bother me. So yeah, this is a 4.5 out of 5 or 5 out of 5 movie, I'm not sure, but either way it's pretty amazing, and if you somehow haven't seen this one yet, I believe it's having a limited run back in theaters again. This is an amazing movie, and even if you don't get much out of the themes or ideas, you'll at least have fun. Tar was directed by Todd Field and was pretty amazing, but definitely have your expectations in check if you're going to see this movie. From the promotional material, I had the impression that this movie would be similar to something like Whiplash, where there would be a large emphasis on the music and the main character would be working on some big upcoming concert. While there is a bit of that, this is not what the vast majority of this movie is. This is essentially a 2-hour and 40-minute dialogue-heavy character study. Most of the scenes in this movie are essentially just two people talking, and through the dialogue, you start to peel back the layers of this character's life. Everything in this movie feels so real and down to earth to the point that if you don't know this movie is about a fictional made-up character, you might think it's a biopic of some sort. It is shot and edited in a way that feels very objective, even though the film is purposely vague about certain details and is careful to show you events in an order as such to not be completely obvious to the audience. There is an aspect of interpretability to this movie that feels honest and earned. You're seeing events develop from the main character's perspective, and as such you are prone to their own biases and interpretation of events, and you are left to decide what the truth is for yourself. I think the main aspect of this movie that might turn some people off is the number of scenes that center around complex musical discussion that might be a bit confusing, especially if you're not so musically inclined such as myself. While I agree that those segments went on for a tad long at some points, I was never really bored during them for some reason. They build up a level of believability between the viewer and the audience. These people are meant to be real conductors and composers, so they speak like it. They don't dumb anything down for the audience, and it makes the setting feel so much more real. Honestly, even though I didn't understand what they were talking about 100% of the time, I still found myself invested in what they were saying for the most part. It was interesting, and you can still kind of get an idea of what it is they're talking about even if you know nothing about musical theory. I should also mention that this thing hinges heavily on Cate Blanchett, and she easily gives what I would consider to be an Oscar-worthy performance. Even though I loved Michelle Yeoh and Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think Cate Blanchett gave the performance of the year here. This definitely isn't a movie that's going to be for everybody, but if you're into slow burns and character dramas, this is one that you can't miss. I'm giving this one a 4.5 out of 5. It was amazing. The Fabelmans is the new Spielberg movie, and it was a completely acceptable and inoffensive experience with not much new to offer. I've never been the biggest fan of a lot of Spielberg's movies personally. I watched E.T. when I was young, but I don't necessarily remember it as being a childhood favorite of mine. There were 1 or 2 times as a kid that I tried watching Indiana Jones, but I could never get into it. I recently revisited Raiders of the Lost Ark, and while I can definitely see why some people would love it, it just isn't really for me. His output in recent years has been nothing to write home about, and personally I find him to be somewhat overrated. Even still, if you are somebody who finds yourself really resonating with his movies, then you will probably love this. There were some really cool and memorable moments in it, and it was mostly engaging throughout, even though it falls into a lot of predictable and retreaded ideas. In particular, there is a point in this movie where our main character goes to a new high school and gets bullied by some jocks but eventually befriends one of them. They are the same tired ideas we have been seeing in family films for decades, and it doesn't necessarily do anything new or interesting with them. Even still, this movie definitely captures Spielberg's love for movies pretty well. There is a scene in particular where the main character is directing one of his actors in a film he's making, and even though his performance overall was nothing special, I thought the film did a pretty good job of portraying how important it was to him that the scene be done well. So yeah, like I said, there are some interesting things in here, but there's not much to say about it overall. It was completely inoffensive and watchable. If you are really into Spielberg's movies, then you'll probably love this movie, but if you don't care much for his movies, then you'll probably not care for this one much either. I don't really have all too much to say, so yeah, I'm giving this one a 3 out of 5. The last movie I saw out of these nominees was Top Gun Maverick. Much like The Fabelmans, it was a totally inoffensive and entertaining movie that didn't have a lot to offer outside of the action set pieces. The scenes where they are in planes in this movie are truly exhilarating and super exciting. I was super invested at the end of this film and have rewatched some of the plane scenes on my own on YouTube because they're just that fun. Unfortunately, I found everything in between to be a slog to get through. There is a romance in this movie that feels so incredibly forced and unnecessary and merely exists to please fans of the original movie. In general, there is a lot of fan service in this. If you're a big fan of the original, you'll probably enjoy that, but as someone who went into this without seeing the original, I just found those moments to be incredibly boring and pointless. Like I said, there isn't a whole lot here to talk about. The action scenes were super fun and it looks like the vast majority of it was completely practical. I believe Tom Cruise was doing his own stunts in this movie, as you would hope from a Tom Cruise movie. He's 60 years old but is still having a lot of fun doing these kinds of movies, and that's nice to see at least. If you're looking for a fun and thrilling action flick to watch with friends or family, this is an easy recommendation. It wasn't anything to write home about, but there were definitely a lot of moments that I loved in it. Giving this one a 3 out of 5. Also, it was watchable. So before I wrap up, I think it might be worth going over some of the nominations and just giving some of my general thoughts. As for Best Picture, like I said, I'd like to see Everything Everywhere All at Once win, but I'm not at all offended with the idea of Tar or Banshees winning it. As for what I think got snubbed, Aftersun was a really interesting movie that kind of caught me off guard when I first watched it. It's a movie where there's not a lot actually happening, but you're kind of supposed to interpret what's going on with the characters. It's extremely subtle, and I also appreciated how the OST complemented the story. I have it listed as a 3.5 out of 5 on my Letterboxd account, but honestly it is extremely likely at this point that I'll bump it up to a 4 out of 5 on rewatch. It's a movie I find myself thinking about pretty often. Decision to Leave is another movie that not only didn't get a Best Picture nomination, but didn't even find itself getting a Best International Film nomination, which is extremely disappointing. It is not necessarily the most original story, but Park Chan-wook elevates it with his amazing directing. Personally, I think Decision to Leave had the best cinematography of any movie this year, and the editing was also pretty great, but the Oscars only choose one foreign film to give love in any given year, and I guess this year it's All Quiet on the Western Front. I'd give Decision to Leave a 4 out of 5, I might lower it to a 3.5 out of 5 at some point, but who knows. In Best Director, I'd like to see the Daniels win just because of how ambitious and all over the place Everything Everywhere was, but I am honestly a little worried at this point that Spielberg is going to win this one. My pick for Best Lead Actor is between Austin Butler and Colin Farrell, both of which I thought did a great job. I haven't seen The Whale yet, but I imagine that Brendan Fraser did a pretty good job in that also. I also love that Paul Mescal whatever, got a nomination for his performance in Aftersun. For supporting actor, I think it would be cool for Ke Huy Quan to win this, even though I have a bad feeling the Oscars are going to prefer Brendan Gleeson or Barry Keoghan, only because the movie they're in is more serious in tone, I guess. For Best Adapted Screenplay, I definitely will have to see Living and Women Talking, because the 3 movies I've seen in this category all have been pretty weak in the screenplay department. I really don't see what was so special about the screenplay in Glass Onion, All Quiet, or Top Gun that they warranted a nomination. My pick for Best Original Screenplay would be Tar, but I wouldn't be offended with Banshees or Everything Everywhere winning it either. But yeah, I'm not going to go through every single category. Overall, I thought this was a pretty decent year for the Oscars. I thought last year's nominations were pretty weak, but I'm pretty happy with the selection we have this year. I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see who wins. Okay, bye.